Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. The January 6th committee just wrapped up its 7th public hearing, laying out its findings, a hearing that included new testimony from former President Trump's White House counsel. We heard from him for the first time, and startling new details about efforts that originated inside the Oval Office to overturn the election results in December of 2020. And when those efforts failed, how Trump then turned his sights to January 6th. Ultimately inciting an insurrection, the committee argued. Some of the most dramatic testimony we heard today focused on an unhinged December 18th meeting in the Oval Office in which Mr. Trump and his loyalists discussed ways to overturn the election, including seizing voting machines. Former President Trump also moved to appoint one of those loyalists, Sidney Powell, as special counsel. When White House officials learned what was going on in the Oval Office, they rushed into that meeting in an effort to stop the president, and the meeting devolved into a screaming match.
What they were proposing, I thought was nuts.
I'm going to categorically describe it as, you guys are not tough enough. Or maybe I put it another way, you're a bunch of pussies. Excuse the expression, but I'm almost certain the word was used.
Flynn screamed at me that I was a quitter and everything, kept on standing up and turning around and screaming at me. And at a certain point, I had it with him. So I yelled back. Either come over or sit your effing.
Now, according to those testimonies, former President Trump was ultimately thwarted from taking action in that meeting. But in the hours after, he then tweeted about a protest in Washington on January 6th, promising it will be wild. We also heard testimony from Stephen Ayers, who stormed the Capitol on January 6th and later pleaded guilty to charges stemming from that day. He testified he believed the election had been stolen because Donald Trump had told him so.
He basically put out, come to stop the steal rally, and I felt like I needed to be down here. When you entered the Capitol last year, did you believe that the election had been stolen? At that time, yeah. Everything that I was seeing online, I definitely believed that that's exactly what that was the case. And when you heard from President Trump that the election was stolen, how did that make you feel? Oh, I was very upset, as were most of his supporters. That's basically what got me to come down here.
Ayers also testified he had no plans to storm the Capitol on January 6th when he was in Washington, but says he did so upon former President Trump's orders. We did get one bombshell at the end of today's hearing. Vice Chair Liz Cheney saying that Mr. Trump tried to call a witness who is part of this investigation. That unnamed witness's lawyer contacted the committee about that attempt, and the committee has provided the Justice Department with that information. That is according to Liz Cheney. As we react and digest all of this, everything we heard from today's hearing, I'm joined by NBC's senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor with the latest from Capitol Hill, NBC News senior reporter Ben Collins, and in a moment I will be joined by NBC legal analyst and defense attorney Danny Savalos. Sahil, I want to start with you and this bombshell that we heard at the end of the hearing. Vice Chair Liz Cheney essentially saying that former President Trump tried to contact a witness whom we haven't heard from yet. We're not exactly sure what that contact looked like, but what did you make of what we learned from Liz Cheney?
It was quite the cliffhanger to a startling hearing, Kristen. Liz Cheney did not provide details, as you point out, as to who this witness was or the nature of that outreach by former President Trump. Now, I'm not a legal expert here. I'll leave it to other legal experts to suss out, what that could mean. But suffice it to say, witness tampering is a very serious crime. And what Liz Cheney has been saying in numerous contexts, along with other members of this committee, is trying to nudge the Justice Department to take much more seriously the possibility of a prosecution. In the views of numerous members of this committee, the Democrats as well as some of the Republicans, the DOJ has been too timid in that regard, and this seems to be another log in that fire in which Liz Cheney has said the committee has shared that information. We don't know, again, who that witness was.
Sahil, we actually have the shot. Let me let our viewers hear it, and then we'll get more reaction on the other side.
After our last hearing, President Trump
tried to call a witness in our investigation, a witness you have not yet seen in these hearings. That person declined to answer or respond to President Trump's call and instead alerted their lawyer to the call. Their lawyer alerted us, and this committee has supplied that information to the Department of Justice. Let me say one more time, we will take any effort to influence witness testimony very seriously.
Ben, before I go back to Sahil, let me get you to weigh in on this point, because there are two things that are happening in this hearing. There's political fallout and potentially legal implications for former President Trump as well. And one of the things, if you talk to legal experts, that they are focused on are these allegations of witness tampering. And here you have Vice Chair Liz Cheney laying out yet another example of potential witness tampering. How significant is that?
That could be a very big deal, in part because, the DOJ needs to charge him with something that you can actually physically look at and say, hey, this is witness tampering. This is something that we know for a fact. It's not this much larger seditious conspiracy stuff that you saw with the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers who came together as two much larger groups. It's a lot easier to prove than these, a guy talked to a guy through a conduit or something like that. If he's witness tampering with this specific committee, then it could be for trouble for him.
It's potentially more tangible evidence, depending on what the shape of that actual outreach was. Sahil, let me go back to you. Let's delve into this December 18th meeting, because it was extraordinary to hear from former White House counsel Pat Cipollone. For the first time, he was in a number of these key meetings. In this particular meeting, he didn't start off in the meeting on December 18th. In fact, he rushed in. We have a little bit more sound about what happened that day, starting with Sidney Powell, who was one of the people really trying to influence the president to convince him to seize voting machines, which Cipollone said was an insane idea. Let's look at a little bit more of the sound.
How much time did you have alone with the president?
Probably no more than 10 or 15 minutes.
Was in that...
I bet Pat Cipollone set a new land speed record.
I opened the door and I walked in. I saw General Flynn. I saw Sidney Powell sitting there. I was not happy to see the people who were in the Oval Office.
Explain why.
I don't think any of these people were providing the president with good advice. And so I didn't understand how they had gotten in.
In the short period of time that you had with the president, did he seem receptive to the presentation that you were making?
He was very interested in hearing particularly about the CISA finding and the terms of 13848 that apparently nobody else had bothered to inform him of.
So, Sahil, basically painting a picture of a president who was desperate, grasping for straws at this point, had lost legal battle after legal battle, and here you had these conspiracy theories and ways in which he could potentially try to win back the election that his own counsel and top advisors were saying is not legal, is not possible.
Yeah, a remarkable bit of testimony from Pat Cipollone, who said, like many other witnesses, that Trump was told repeatedly by senior officials and advisors in his administration that he had lost the election, that there was no evidence of potential election-changing fraud here. That meeting, which apparently got quite heated, Cipollone mentioned that, after Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and others in that camp made their argument that there is evidence, he said, well, show it to us. Put up or shut up. Where is the evidence? They didn't have the evidence, he said, and at some point, the president should have conceded the election. There was many witnesses speaking to this point, and the committee is trying its hardest to make the case that Trump was told repeatedly, had every reason to believe that he lost the election, and yet he persisted. They're trying to make, Kristen, the argument of bad faith here, because in theory, if Trump actually had reason to believe that the election was being stolen from him, that everything he did in the run-up to January 6th, including the day of January 6th, could conceivably be seen in a very different light. Instead, you had had a number of his allies who were fearful that his remarks, his rhetoric, his tweets were stirring up this extremist violent mob. They played some, they showed some words from online extremists, who saw the president's rhetoric as a call to arms, as a call to violence, that they believed they were acting on his desires when they decided to take up arms and go to the Capitol. That's what we saw a lot of after that on the day of January 6th, including one Republican, Debbie Lesko, who said she feared that a bunch of Trump supporters came to the Capitol expecting their election to be overturned. And in her view, once that didn't happen, they were going to go nuts. These fears were everywhere in the run-up.
And of course, all of these moments and exchanges and new revelations today, the committee hopes will paint a picture of culpability for former President Trump. Danny Savalas, who's joined us now on set, I want to play a soundbite from Vice Chair Liz Cheney. She opened up the hearing with this idea of basically saying that you can't just let the president off the hook. You cannot just make excuses for him. I want to play a little bit of this first soundbite that we have, and then get your reaction on the other side.
President Trump is a 76-year-old man. He is not an impressionable child. Donald Trump had access to more detailed and specific information showing that the election was not actually stolen than almost any other American. And he was told this over and over again. No rational or sane man in his position could disregard that information and reach the opposite conclusion. And Donald Trump cannot escape responsibility by being willfully blind.
You and I have talked a lot about willful ignorance, and essentially Vice Chair Cheney, it seems like, tried to make part of that argument today. Were there legal implications for you, what you heard in that broader argument that she was making?
She makes a very good point. I mean, throughout this, folks like me get on the air and say, well, yes, everybody told him, but what if he didn't know? And, oh, Kristen, oh, how I wish my own regular clients that you've never heard of are given shown that same quarter by federal prosecutors or state prosecutors, because everybody knows in criminal court that you can prove up intent by circumstantial evidence. Because the reality is we cannot open up someone's head and peer inside and know what they actually knew or actually thought. So in court, we use circumstantial evidence. And there comes a point where somebody's ignorance must be willful if they've been told again and again. Now, if I can just play devil's advocate very briefly, if the defense would argue, if there ever were a defense and this ever were a criminal case, they would argue that Trump indeed was told that he did win the election by people. Now, were those people and their information dubious? Yeah, maybe, but to what degree is he allowed to rely on people like Rudy Giuliani, on the other people, the witnesses that we heard from today? Who knows?
Well, and we heard more evidence to this idea that he was told again and again. And the significance of Pat Cipollone is that literally he's in the room where it all happened most of the time, where a lot of these conversations unfolded. And there's another notable exchange here where he bolsters what we've heard from a number of the other witnesses, which is that he also told the former president that he could not win, that he did not win, and that he believed it was time to concede. And if we could play that soundbite as well, this is the fourth soundbite on our list, which really underscores that point.
I want to start by asking if you agree, Mr. Cipollone, with the conclusions of Matt Morgan, of Bill Barr, of all of the individuals who evaluated those claims, that there is no evidence of election fraud sufficient to undermine the outcome in a particular state.
Yes, I agree with that.
Did you, in your mind, form a belief that the president should concede the election loss at a certain point after the election?
Well, again, I was the White House counsel. Some of those decisions are political. So to the extent that, but if your question is that I believe he should concede the election at a point in time, yes, I did.
What is the significance of hearing the former White House counsel say, yes, I did think he should concede?
For the committee, the argument is, here's somebody who is objective because he is White House counsel, but he's also very learned, very knowledgeable, very esteemed, and telling the president, look, I'm your White House counsel, I think you should concede. Now, again, looking at the other side, because we have to do that. If we think of this as a prosecution, we have to think about what the defense would say. And they would make an argument, something to the extent of, bah, that you're not a loyalist, fat on you, We are, I am Donald Trump. I'm going to listen to some of my other advisors, whether that's Sidney Powell and whether that's Rudy Giuliani. Now you get into an area where is it reasonable to listen to them? That is the key, because he is getting whispers in his ear from those folks.
And Ben made the point earlier that one of the things that was arguably more tangible than some of this circumstantial evidence that the committee has laid out is the fact that at the end we heard this bombshell from Vice Chair Liz Cheney, who seemed to suggest that they have new evidence of potential witness tampering by the former president himself. She said that he reached out to a witness, and we haven't heard from yet. What did you make of that revelation? How significant is it from, again, if you're the Attorney General, if you're watching these proceedings, how significant is that?
First of all, the committee knows how to tease the next hearing. Come back next week. You won't be disappointed. And they've done it at the end of every hearing, left us with a cliffhanger. This is an example. Now, anytime you criminalize speech, and potentially tampering with a witness is a form of criminalizing speech, the key is not just the words. The key is the context. These words don't exist in a vacuum. So what I would want to know right away, and Lester pointed this out just on the last set when we were just on set together, his question was perfect. Was there a voicemail? That's going to give us some words. If it was just a missed call from, I don't know what that would look like on the caller ID, but, Trump or whatever, if it's just a missed call, is that enough? Possibly, depending on the relationship between the caller and the receiver. So anytime you criminalize words, you really have to look at exactly what was said and what it meant to the hearer. If that is a form of intimidation to even just hear from the president, if, for example, this witness had never heard from the president, never met him, never talked to him, now you're getting a call from a former president. Yikes.
And one of the things that was significant about today's hearings, in addition to hearing from former White House counsel Pat Cipollone, was that, Ben, they tried to draw a direct link between former President Trump and the rioters, those who took to the Capitol that day. And I believe we have a soundbite from Stephen Ayers, who was one of the rioters. In fact, he pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct for storming the Capitol. I want to play a little bit of his sound. I want to get your reaction on the other side, Ben, because he essentially says he marched on the Capitol because of the former president. And we are waiting to get that soundbite. But the bottom line, yes, quote him.
What it was going to be was an armed revolution.
Yeah. And he also said he didn't come to D.C. on that day with the intention of storming the Capitol. And the committee member said, so then why'd you do it? And he said, because Mr. Trump told us to march to the Capitol. Of course, remarks he made in that speech that the former president delivered. We also know there was a draft tweet in which Mr. Trump was going to call for people to march to the Capitol. He held back on that. Instead, a number of his top advisors saying that they wanted it to be more impromptu. And we do have Stephen Ayers now in his own words.
When you arrived on the ellipse that morning, were you planning on going to the Capitol?
No, we didn't actually plan to go down there. We went basically to see the Stop the Steal rally, and that was it.
So why'd you decide to march to the Capitol?
Well, basically, the president, got everybody riled up, told everybody to head on down. So we basically were just following what he said.
What was your reaction to hearing that, Ben?
Well, what's fascinating about this is that the Proud Boys seem to know. They went down before the speech ended to go to the Capitol. The Oath Keepers seem to know. Same deal with them. A lot of people at that rally did not. There were a lot of useful idiots, is the technical term for it. They went down after when Donald Trump told them to. What's also interesting about this is that Donald Trump did not have this in his speech. This is what we learned today. This was said impromptu in the speech. But there were people who knew he was going to say this in the speech. People like Ali Alexander or Alex Jones or Roger Stone. These people who are not in the White House. They are not even in that fringe of the White House, even in, the Sidney Powell and Patrick Byrne part of the White House. These people weren't in that meeting, but they still knew somehow. And the last question is, how did these people know the president was going to say something that his advisors did not want him to say and took out of his speech? That's something we're going to hopefully learn next week.
Danny, quickly weigh in on that. And did the committee do a good job of creating a direct, tangible link between the former president and the rioters who stormed the Capitol that day.
I don't think they advanced the ball anymore today with their evidence. And that may be an unpopular opinion, but most of what we heard today we already knew. And the two witnesses are essentially an example of witnesses who have, quote, left the church. They're fascinating. I want to hear their story, but I'm not so sure they provided a direct link other than what we already know, which is Trump said some words, something to the effect of "will be wild," and some misguided followers misbehaved as a result. You're still going to need to draw a connection, and that connection is called foreseeability, proximate cause in the law. In other words, when Trump acted, when he uttered those words, did he know or have reason to know that this would be the response? We have heard some evidence of that, but not a clear line, and really nothing new that wasn't known before, other than some of the contextual, shocking facts that come out that tend to paint Trump in an immoral light, but not necessarily in a criminal light, not yet.
Yeah, someone said to me, if you don't like Trump, you like him even less.
Yes.
This doesn't necessarily advance the legal challenges for Trump. Fantastic conversation. There was so much to unpack. Ben, Danny, Sahil, really appreciate you getting us started today. I now want to bring in Carol Leonnig, investigative reporter from The Washington Post, and Carol Lam, former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst. Carol Lam, let me start with you, and can you pick up on the point that we're just discussing here? Do you think that the committee advanced the potential legal jeopardy for former President Trump? Did they draw a direct enough line between the former president's tweets, his actions, his unwillingness to concede, and the rioters who stormed the Capitol on that day?
I actually think they did make some progress here. I'll tell you why. They focused very much on a timeline, and they also focused on what was happening with respect to these conversations that the president was participating in and the people he was surrounding himself with. A lot of time was spent on this, what they've called the unhinged meeting at the White House on December 18th. And what they showed was an absolutely knockdown, drag-out fight between the president's, for lack of a better word, I'll call them fringe attorneys, and the properly instituted attorneys who were working for the White House at that time. What that shows is that just shortly after that, in the wee hours after midnight, the president texts, come on January 6th. He texts to his supporters, come on January 6th. It's going to be wild. So here's why I'm starting to move a little bit towards increasing liability, criminal liability for the president. And by that, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that the attorney general should or would bring charges, but from a purely legal perspective, there is the liability that attaches when you are willing to engage in force to overthrow a function of the government. And when we argue before a jury, we often say, if this is true, what else must be true? Now, if Trump was willing to see violence visited on his own vice president, if he was willing to partake in a sham where he pretends that he's impromptu, spontaneously going to urge the mob to march on the Capitol, but actually it was planned days before, if he was willing to look past all the advice he's being given, and most importantly to me, if after the violence at the Capitol he does nothing for hours, what does that necessarily mean? And to me, it means that this wasn't an unanticipated surprise that paralyzed him for a few hours. It means he knew it was a possibility, he expected it, he was satisfied and happy about it. That disturbs me greatly. I think that's why the committee did move the ball today.
Carol Leonnig, weigh in on that. In what ways do you think the committee moved the ball today? And what was the biggest takeaway for you? Was it the new revelations about the December 18th meeting, the fact that tweet did resonate so forcefully with some of the rioters, the bombshell at the end about the witness tampering? What were your big takeaways today?
So I think, what's really important to keep in mind as we review this hearing is the biggest bombshell is clearly that the former president tried to reach out to a witness. That's the most stunning new thing. But I think as well, it's so correct to say that all of these pieces are starting to fill in. You know, you have a prosecutor now describing, well, this is very disturbing to me. This happened. The president was knowledgeable that violence was likely or possible. He wanted to put a target on the back of his vice president, despite the advice of his aides. He wanted to side with Team Crazy and ignore fact and encourage folks to come for a wild event, which was, by the way, an illegal. There was no permit for a march on the Capitol, and he knew that, and he was planning days ahead of time to go to that march. So all of these things are starting to fill in, and I will just reiterate a key fact from a previous hearing, which was the president was aware that rally goers had weapons, and he asked his own Secret Service not to worry about taking those weapons away from them. He wanted them in his little corral, if you will, at the Ellipse, and then he wanted to send them to the Capitol. All of those things, I think, have a mosaic feeling. Nobody has taken out the smoking gun in these hearings. Nobody said, here's the moment where Donald Trump planned a coup and unleashed it. It's the mosaic that shows you how many steps he took to plan and unleash it. And the fact that he knew violence was not just likely, almost inevitable, and encouraged people who were armed to head to the Capitol. Just stunning.
Carol Lam, how problematic is that? I mean, I think Carol Leonnig raises such an important point that we can't forget that the committee did show several hearings ago that the president was aware that the rioters were armed. How does that fit into the mosaic?
Look, that's huge. When Cassidy Hutchinson said, not only was the president made aware that these people gathering at the Ellipse were armed, and then those are the same people that he encouraged to march on the Capitol. So he knows they're armed. He's encouraging to march to the Capitol. He's not saying, hey, leave your guns and your daggers and your knives here. We'll march peacefully down towards the Capitol. No, quite to the contrary. He's saying, let's go. And he's riling them up. Extremely problematic. And I guess what I'm saying is, as Carol points out, there's so much now, brick by brick by brick, there's so much that at a certain point, a reasonable person has to say, nobody could, in this context, say that they didn't know violence was going to be a likely result if the president didn't get what he wanted that day.
And that goes back to the point that Vice Chair Liz Cheney made, which is that he's a 78-year-old man, not a child. All right, Carol Leonnig, Carol Lam, thank you so much for helping us break down and understand what happened today. 7 public hearings, 18 witnesses, and hours of testimony in 1 month. And folks, we are just getting started. My panel breaks down what we've learned and what it means for the former president. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Awesome. Welcome back. The DOJ may or may not choose to go after Mr. Trump after the committee finishes its work. But either way, the former president will be tried in the court of public opinion. The hearings may be resonating with voters in a way that could seriously impact Republican support for Mr. Trump as the party's 2024 candidate. Joining me now to discuss this, John Podhoretz, editor of Commentary Magazine, and Democratic strategist Basil Smikle. Thanks to both of you for being here. Really appreciate it. So I was getting texts from Republicans during this hearing. One of them said to me, this is devastating for former President Trump politically. The reason why, no, more people are not going to come out and start speaking out against him, but it just starts to chip away at his support around the edges, they say, particularly when it comes to moderate Republicans and independents. John, how true is that?
I mean, I think it's corrosive. I think it can be corrosive, and we see polling data that suggests that his standing among Republicans is declining, that there are significant numbers of Republicans who are looking for an alternative. But I do have a caveat, which is that in the case of, say, Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony, not today's, but there are a couple of details that are not fixed. And Zoe Lofgren, the California Democrat who was on the committee and talked about Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel's testimony, said they did not attempt to corroborate the testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson. That's not their purpose. That was a very, very, very bad thing that she did, because that gives the lie to the idea that they are a fact-finding commission and not simply just building a kind of prosecutorial case, and they don't want any possible alternate accounts of what happened on January 6th. I think that is the sort of thing Trump can use to leverage himself back in the idea that he's being mishandled by the committee.
So I'm glad that you raised that point, right? Because, and that actually is supported by my reporting, Basil, the fact that the committee never directly asked Pat Cipollone. We saw that today to corroborate what we heard from Cassidy Hutchinson. You were looking for a split screen of the two of them kind of echoing each other, and that didn't happen. Legal experts say there's still no smoking gun against former President Trump.
Well, I tend to agree with that. And I think you're absolutely right. There is no smoking gun. What we heard at the end about the witness tampering, maybe there's something. But again, I don't know if any of that amounts to him being walked off in handcuffs, which I think a lot of voters are looking for, but don't think will ever really happen. And at the end of all of this, the committee doesn't really have any teeth. They can't actually, bring charges, and everything's got to go to DOJ. So again, at the end of all of this whole conversation of all these hearings, I think he does get made unelectable in a primary. I do think that. But down ballot is where I get
in a
more
primary.
concerned.
You think he's unelectable in a primary?
I think the goal here is to make him unelectable in a primary.
Let's look at the numbers, okay? Because there are these new numbers from the New York Times Siena College poll, and they're pretty stark. First of all, you have President Biden beating former President Trump by 3 points. You also have these numbers out today with Trump at 49%, Ron DeSantis at 25%, Ted Cruz at 7%, Pence at 6%, Haley at 6%, Pompeo at 2%. Bottom line, Trump's below 50%. Now, he still wins it, John. But if you're in the former president's camp, those numbers have to be disconcerting.
I think they are disconcerting for him. In the Republican primaries in 2016, he did not get more than 45% of the aggregate vote. Because they have a winner-take-all structure in the Republican primary system. He won convincingly, but what this suggests, if these numbers are correct or following, is that Trump's support is declining to the place that it was when he ran in 2016. That his dominance of the Republican Party, his control of the Republican Party electorate, is not what it was.
And Basil, at the same time, he did win in 2016. He did win the nomination despite conventional wisdom suggesting otherwise.
Well, the two things. One, I don't think the dynamic of him being able to pick off everyone on the debate stage that you saw in 2016, I don't think that that dynamic can hold true in 2024, because the conversation is just going to be different, and people are used to seeing him in that regard, number one. And number two, one of the problems is actually on the Democratic side, that we talked a lot about fear, and Hillary Clinton said chapter and verse what was going to happen. Some of us didn't believe her. But there is now a bit more proof there. And I think if we combine a good message with the right messenger, then I think on the Democratic side, then you have a good sort of counter narrative.
Okay, go ahead, John.
I just want to say one thing, which is the numbers in the New York Times poll indicate that Democrats and the American people in general are very concerned about Biden's age, right?
64% of Democrats saying that they want a different candidate.
But they're very concerned about Biden's age. So Trump ain't no spring chicken. I mean, the best Republican line against Biden, aside from policy questions, is, look, he's just too old. He'll be 82. He's too old. That line can be used against Trump. Ron DeSantis is 43 years old.
Well, and that's why I lay out that poll, because when you look at it, he's really, at this point, we're so early, it's hard to even talk about it, but he's really the only one who would give Mr. Trump a run for his money, it seems. And of course, he's at 25% now. But if he were to actually campaign, who knows what would happen? Or would he get into the race, though, if the former president ran? I want to ask you, though, Basil, about the Democrats' numbers, because you have these just staggering numbers. 64% of Democrats saying they don't want to see former President Biden run again in 2024. So does he need to change his messaging? Does he need to get more legislation passed? What does he need to do in order to see those numbers?
Interesting, because I was talking to one of my students, And she said the same thing about Joe Biden, but she loved Bernie Sanders. I was like, but they're right. So what's but that's an important difference, because Bernie has that energy and he's speaking directly to policy that engages young people. What I think Joe Biden needs to do is more of that and actually get some more wins under the belt. And the Democrats need to keep talking more about that because, we can, gun control is obviously very important. Working with the governors to shore up abortion rights, extraordinarily important. But there got to be some small pieces that he can go out there and start talking about, and he should give his vice president a little more opportunity to shine. There are a lot of Democrats that feel she's been too behind the scenes, and I think that actually can help his numbers.
John?
I just think he's too old. I mean, I don't know what to say. Look, I don't like his policies. I think he's been a bad president. I don't like how he's handled inflation. He's going to be 82 years old on Inauguration Day 2025. That is too old.
The White House says there's nothing we can do about that. That's the one thing we can't impact. Let me ask you, though. I mean, if former President Trump does announce, and there are some concerns that he will announce this summer, and then the midterms will be all about Mr. Trump. Do you think that we will see other Republicans like Ron DeSantis get into the race now that we're seeing some of these numbers come out?
I think some very serious people are going to run against Trump in the end. I did not think this 2 months. Well, DeSantis is the obvious. You never know what people have that might keep them from jumping in. DeSantis is the obvious person. There are others. You can't look at these numbers and say somebody's not going to say, look, this is my moment. Trump could collapse on a stage. There are things that can happen. He's 76 years old and not fit. Biden's 79 and he's pretty fit, and he fell off that bicycle. All Trump has to do is trip, and he's in trouble.
Well, because we're talking about the hearings, I want to continue to kind of explore the potential political fallout of these hearings. Basil, do you worry that they could backfire against Democrats, that they could appear to be overly politicized?
Sure, and I think to some extent a lot of Republicans feel that already, and that's something that we have to concern ourselves with. But I go back to the first impeachment. Voters coming up to me and said, how are you going to hold Donald Trump accountable? The fact that this is happening is that accountability argument. And again, I don't know that a lot of voters think that they're going to see Donald Trump walking out in handcuffs, but they want to know that Democrats are actually telling the story, and they've told a fantastic narrative about what the Trump White House was like in those final days.
John, to raise a point that we always hear from Chuck, what happens if Trump runs, if he loses, and if he doesn't concede?
Well, nothing good. I mean, I do think...
Is that a concern amongst Republicans, do you think?
It should be. So far, I see no indication that it is. I do think that there is now an immense amount of emotional preparation for that possibility, and a lot of shoring up that can be done. And just remember that Trump will not be president if he doesn't win, right? He will be the guy who didn't win. I don't know where Biden will be, whether he will be the nominee or not the nominee. But he won't be sitting in the White House making these plans. And one thing you can say about the Stop the Steal people and whatever conspiracies they're up to, they're frightening, but they're little Keystone cops, and they seem a little bonkers. And I don't know that they'll be able to pull off a massive national Civil War confrontation.
Though I'll just say very quickly, if you're a person of color, or I imagine if you're a woman, given what's happening at the Supreme Court, Keystone cops perhaps, but that's still got to put a credible amount of fear in you, because you just don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
I don't even think you need that ideological frame. I think you can be frightened simply by the idea that people don't accept the results of an election that's fair.
Great conversation. Thank you, John and Basil. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being here on set. And next, we're going to head to Israel, where just hours from now, the president will kick off his first official trip to the Middle East with a series of high-stakes meetings. What to watch for, and why some members of the president's own party are taking issue with his itinerary. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. President Biden will depart Washington, D.C. tonight for his first trip to the Middle East as president. The trip comes as he faces political challenges at home and abroad. We were just talking about some of them. The president will make stops in Israel, the West Bank, and Saudi Arabia as he tries to tackle major issues, including oil prices, the Iran nuclear deal, and the overall stability of the region. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have been critical of President Biden's decision to go to Saudi Arabia after vowing to make them a pariah state. In an op-ed in the Washington Post, the president defended that decision, writing, quote, "When I meet with Saudi leaders on Friday, my aim will be to strengthen a strategic partnership going forward that's based on mutual interests and responsibilities, while also holding true to fundamental American values." I am joined now by my colleague Carol Lee, who just traveled to Jerusalem, and she joins us now. She's there ahead of President Biden's arrival. Carol, thanks so much for being here. I know it has been a long journey to get there. Let's start off by talking about this key meeting between President Biden and the Saudi Crown Prince. All eyes are going to be on that meeting. The question, I guess, is how is the administration squaring their commitment to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state while also this willingness by the president to meet with MBS?
Well, Kristen, they're really not. They've kind of given up this notion that the president's going to try to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state. While that is something that the president said during the campaign, realpolitik has since intervened, and the president and the White House are focused on what they say are strategic objectives rather than ideals. And so while you hear from the White House that human rights is something that the president always raises on the world stage, and when he's meeting with world leaders, they're very clear that this is a trip that's about focusing on the relationship with Saudi Arabia. There's a reason why the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have had this strategic relationship for the past 80 years, and that is stability in the region, as you mentioned, and oil. And that is, frankly, the main driver here and the big focus. And that's what everybody is going to be looking for coming out of the president's meetings in Saudi Arabia. What does he get in terms of oil production from Saudi Arabia? We know that the White House wants them to keep production up. And so is the president going to come out of this with some sort of deliverable? That remains to be seen. The expectations, though, Kristen, are so low going into this trip that it's very possible that whatever the president winds up coming home with will be seen, at least by this administration, as a win.
I think you're absolutely right. And the deliverables is the key word here, because people are going to be looking for deliverables not only with his meeting with MBS. And as you say, the expectations are very low, but expectations are also low with his visit to Israel, correct?
Yeah, it's really changed just given the political turmoil here in Israel since the president announced that he was going to be making this visit, and since he'll arrive here tomorrow. And so the president has meetings here. This is more of a very traditional visit. That's what we're expecting. Except one thing to note is that there is no longer an expectation that the president will be shaking hands with anybody because of COVID, which is an interesting dynamic. He'll have that welcoming ceremony in Israel when he arrives, and then he'll go into a series of meetings. And the goal really is just to show solidarity with Israel, to try to, one of the goals that the administration has in the region is to get Israel and Saudi Arabia closer to normalizing relations. So we may see some announcements there. And then Iran, that's the great unifier of the Gulf states and Israel in this region. And so that'll be a huge topic of discussion. I think you could look for the Israeli government and the U.S. government to have some sort of statement about what the goal is. They're obviously not in agreement when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, but they would like to at least put forward some sort of more closely aligned statement on what the goals are when it comes to Iran.
And Carol, just very quickly before I let you go, what does a successful trip for the president look like, given the expectations are so low on both of his stops?
I think a couple things. Look, the one thing that the administration really wants is just a reset here with Saudi Arabia. And what everybody will be looking for at home, particularly the president's critics who don't want him to be making this trip, is what does he say on the human rights issues? And so how he raises those, how he tries to walk that line, and how he tries to also get something from Saudi Arabia in terms of oil. Although the administration makes clear that that's not something that's going to show up for a while, months, not weeks.
All right, Carol, fantastic reporting. You've been covering this region for quite some time. Really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.